This advanced professional practice unit to part 4, crime scene preservation. And actually, the difference between PCP and ACP is probably really no different. But let's talk about some of the ACP implications anyway. So, anytime there's a potential crime scene, obviously, you know, your personal safety is your first priority, your patient is your second priority, and crime scene preservation is the third priority. And this is important because number 2 means that anytime you've got a cardiac arrest, if they're not code 5, then we're going to attempt to resuscitate them. We don't worry about the crime scene so much. We don't worry about how this is going to affect the investigation. We do our best to resuscitate. And so when do we stage? Basically when dispatch tells us to stage. When do we call for 10200? Well, whenever we need police, obviously. 102,000 whenever we feel our life is in danger. You know, the question is, do we call it 102,000 if someone else's life are in danger? My partner and I remember we went out for breakfast early one morning, a sunny Saturday morning, and we got to the restaurant. It was closed. It was opening up in a half an hour, so we decided we'll just drive around town. So we drive around town, and we're about to turn on this block, and we see some guy who's staggering on the road. He looks like he's in his 20s. He's kind of staggering on the sidewalk, and you know, both of us thought, let's just turn here and avoid this guy because he just looks like a goofy drunk, right? So we turned the corner, and right after we turned the corner, we saw 2 guys who looked very similar, in their 20s, maybe late teens, jeans, no shirts, and in this like all-out fist fight in this alleyway, and they were just pounding away at each other. So we called for a 10200. We parked about a block away and called for 10200 on a code 4 basis, but didn't call for 102,000. And to this day, I'm still debating whether that should have been a 102,000 or 10200, but I'm comfortable with the decision on a 10200. What do you guys think? Would you call it a 102,000 because of risk to the 2 of them, or a 10200? You say 10200, Andrew? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, reserve 2,000 for my partner and myself. Fair enough. Yeah, I guess it depends on how bad the fight's looking. Although, you know, if there were knives involved, would you call it 102,000 then? I don't know that I would. I would call 10200 and just ask them to tell police that it's a knife fight, and leave it at that. Because technically, it's not my life in danger or my partner's life in danger, but it's definitely someone's life in danger. And I think when you call it 10200 on a code 4 basis and you tell them it's a knife fight, they're going to know, obviously, you know, someone's life is in danger. So let's see here. If we believe a crime has taken place, we call police ACP, obviously, 10200. And now I put 102,000 if someone's life is in danger, but in retrospect, it's really about whether your life and my life is in danger, maybe not someone else's. I think we can still call it 10200 and say it's a gunfight or a knife fight or something, and they know it's serious. So how do we approach on foot? What path do we take? The recommendation from the number of homicide detectives and forensic investigators I've had in classes to speak with my PCP students in the past has always been take the path less followed and take a single path, both you and your partner. So if going up the stairs, a carpeted stairs, for example, take, you know, close to the wall or close to the railing, because footprints from the assailant are most likely to be in the center of the stairs, and they might be able to get prints off of the carpet. Certainly in the snow, that would be the case. You know, you want to avoid any footprints in the snow and follow a different path, and make sure that you and your partner are in a straight line with one another. Take the same path in that you take back out. That's really the bottom line. Some life-saving habits. So we want to park the ambulance strategically. One of the problems I find all the time with police and fire incidents is that police and fire oftentimes block our egress. It drives me out of my mind. And so if you're able to park strategically, you want to do that. You want to walk separately, but in a straight line, one behind the other, and or in whichever direction the police instruct us to go, or have someone lead us into the patient, take the path least followed, and write an incident report about it later. So personal safety, in terms of walking in a scene where we're not sure what's going on, it's important to have some situational awareness and try to identify anything in your own mind that seems incongruent with the call information that would suggest potential for abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse, or something going on in the scene. Are there any indications of violence or gang presence? And are there any other people around? Are there unusual orders like gas? Any unusual sights or sounds? Make notes later. And are the police there, and do they need to be there? And how do we call for them, or when do we call for them? So some do's and don'ts for a suspected crime scene. This is an actual crime scene. This was a photo given to me by one of the homicide detectives who gave a talk to one of my classes. And so always a good idea to stand to the side of a door when knocking or ringing. What's the likelihood that you knock on an apartment door and someone starts shooting through the door? Extremely unlikely. You'll likely go your entire career without anything like that happening, but that's the insurance policy we take out, right? Is we're always cautious. I actually I had one incident, didn't involve guns or knives or anything, but I had one incident where we knocked on the door, we stood to the side, and this young guy opened the door and ran right past us and down the exit. And when we poked our head inside the door and asked the patient if she was all right, she was crying and upset. So we called the 10200s, and it turned out she was an exacerbated COPD, but her son had beaten her up. So you just never know what you're going to run into, right? We want to avoid touching things if at all possible. Avoid disturbing any blood spatters. And that's the official term, is spatters, not splatters, if you didn't know that. And want to stay away from walls, furniture, and anything with blood if at all possible, but that's not always practical. And so here's some boot prints that might be invaluable to the police in terms of identifying the assailant, because every boot print, every footprint is like a signature, is like a fingerprint, in the sense that every boot will have there may be boots with the same tread, but because they're worn by different people, they may have different marks in them from the walking pattern. So take the path least follows, as I mentioned. Take a less obvious path and follow the same path back. Some other do's and don'ts: avoid touching door frames, cases, and watch for blood spatter, and try not to smear it. Not always possible when you're doing resuscitation in a confined space. Other do's and don'ts: so we want to avoid putting our equipment bags down if the patient appears to be obviously dead, as per policy 4.4. And so we just do a quick assessment and then exit, right? It's tempting to hang around and check things out at a crime scene, but really we should be spending as little time as possible. In fact, the more time we spend in there, the more we'll have to be aware of and document in terms of notes and be accountable for as a witness in court. So it's probably better just to spend minimal amount of time in there, do your code 5 assessment, and leave. We don't want to overturn furniture or fix overturned furniture unless we're doing a resuscitation and that furniture needs to be moved for that purpose, in which case I would probably just ask a police officer to move a coffee table or something out of the way. But if you do, you got to make a mental note of what you did and jot it down later in an incident report. So do's and don'ts. That's quite the weapon, eh? I bet police were excited when they seized that little beauty. So weapons, drugs, paraphernalia rather. Ask police to remove it. Not unreasonable to ask police to frisk someone. I had a guy who had was stabbed by his buddy in the abdomen, and I asked the police officer to frisk this guy before we transport him because I didn't know if he was carrying anything, and I think that's unreasonable, or reasonable rather. So this slide is really old, or this bullet point is really old. Don't use the phone at the scene. In the old days, before cell phones, we used to pick up the resident's phone number and call our base hospital doc, but they can use that phone to trace back the previous call. And we want to avoid moving the patient until police have arrived. If it's well, I don't know why we'd want to move the patient anyway, but if it's a resuscitation, you got to move the patient, then you move the patient. But we don't move the body if it's a body. And if we run a resuscitation, if you know, we got someone with multiple stabbings and they're on the bed and we have to move them to the floor to do resuscitation, then we leave them there on the floor. We don't change anything. We don't move them back to the bed. We just document and draw what we did on an incident report later. So if resuscitation is required, we do what we've got to do and avoid disturbing anything if at all possible, and not judge in our approach to the patient and scene, and document all relevant findings. But an incident report will contain any of the other things that are outside the resuscitation that might be of interest. So when cutting off clothes, for example, we want to avoid cutting through bullet holes or stab holes in the shirt, and give those garments to the police. And if resuscitation is required, if you have to turn on the light, let the police know, and maybe critical information in the court. What I do is I try to keep track of all my garbage. Little stuff I usually shove in my pocket, like plastic bags and things like that, but it's a good idea to get a garbage bag or something where you can start putting garbage into so it never hits the floor. And never use paper from the scene to make notes. I've seen that happen where you know, someone takes a piece of paper off a pad sitting on the coffee table for a suicide who's code 5, and that's always a bad idea because a suicide is a crime until proven otherwise, right? But, so chart what you see, what you're told, and the source it came from. Is someone fiddling with the slides? Because we keep going back here, and it's driving me a little crazy. So important to remember that you know, anything the patient says to you is admissible provided it's what they call a spontaneous utterance. In other words, if you say to a patient, "Who did this to you?" That's really not a paramedic question, that's a police question. So that's a question I would just avoid asking. But if they happen to say, you know, "I can't believe my cousin Fred did this to me," that's a spontaneous utterance, and that's admissible in court. So you've got to be careful around the types of questions you ask. They need to be medically pertinent, medically relevant. Now, if the cop's there and they ask, that's fine. That's a different thing altogether, but it's not the question I would ask because you'll get grilled about that. So if resuscitation fails, patient's pronounced or you get a TOR is received, want to leave the patient in the position found, and or the position for resuscitation efforts, and consult with the coroner as to where to place the body post-pronouncement. Most of the time, we'll just leave the body where it is, unless it's in a public place. And we leave all equipment in place. So the endotracheal tube stays in place, we disconnect the BVM, IV stays in place, we just turn down the roller clamp, and anything else just stays exactly where it is. We don't cover the body with sheets or blankets. Police want to do that, they can do that. When it comes to sexual assaults, want to approach the patient with caution and compassion, and generally it's a good idea if it's a female assault victim that a female paramedic attend, and but the level of care may dictate who attends, but rarely are there calls that require ACB intervention in these cases, right? So important to explain everything that you're doing, may help alleviate some of the stress, make them more cooperative, and never touch the patient without consent. Is someone hitting the slides or something? Because I don't know why the text keeps just disappearing here. So try not to let the patient bathe, and because the team will need to obtain specimens for evidence, and so even if the patient states that they're not pressing charges at that time, it's important to try to elicit their cooperation to go to the emerge and get assessed. And any clothes that we take, and if we take a jacket off so we can take a blood pressure on their arm, for example, you want to make sure that that stays with the patient or is put in a bag and given to police later. And you want to make sure that they don't clean any wounds or anything like that, that they don't wash their hands, because they may have the assailant's DNA under their fingernails or something. And so I want to keep all stretcher sheets, pillowcases, and dressings and give those to the receiving facility or to police, right? Because they may contain things like follicular fallout and things like that. So some life-saving habits when approaching the scene. I don't know what's going on with these slides here. Is there a vehicle in the driveway? Is the front door open or closed? Are there any people around? Someone's mic was on. Are you going to say something? Any unusual orders? Move away from the doors. Look for any potential alternative exits or escape routes from the scene. And just remember, the stethoscope around your neck can be used against you. We want to stand back far away enough from people that that you can see their feet in your peripheral vision. If you're within arm's length of a person, they can hit you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Human reflexes are not fast enough to defend yourself, unless you're a 7th degree black belt, in monkey kung fu or something. But otherwise, yeah, so like the back of the ambulance. Well, yeah, you're in a bit of a bad spot there, exactly. So we want to plan ahead and use 10-2000 if we need to. Has anyone had to call a 10-2000? Just out of curiosity, I have once, and I know a crew that I work with called last summer, and it was a complete disaster. Police were very slow in coming.
I've had to do one once. We went to it was out in the woods. It was a ATV collision. It was two sons are like 25, 28-ish.
Yeah.
And the father was on scene fighting everyone. One of them was an obvious. So we had to do 10-2000.
Nice. Wicked. Yeah, so let's just see here. What else? So in summary, personal safety first, obviously. Take the path less followed. Avoid disturbing the scene. Document careful without judgment. And on a separate incident report, we document things that we see, smell, or hear or find that might be relevant to the investigation. Important not to ask leading non-medical questions. And inform police of anything we do that alters the scene in any way, shape, or form, like moving furniture, for example. We want to get a mental picture of the scene, and does anything look incongruent? Is anyone behaving incongruently? And is there any sign of gang presence? Okay, so I'm getting a message here that Charles is moving the slides. Charles, is that you? Resuming the evidence.
All I can say is I have certainly not touched my mouse throughout the whole thing, so I don't know what's going on there.
Oh yeah, it's weird because a message coming up saying that Charles is moving the slides. There's another one came up with Pavel's moving the slides, so I don't know what's going on here. That's right. So, yeah, whenever possible, don't touch things, don't lean. And obviously we're not going to use a phone, but watch for blood on the walls. Try not to smear it. And leave things alone, like thermostats. Windows are open, leave them open. You know, let the police close them. They're going to close them. And take notes down later. Someone's got an open mic. Can they say something? Or, oh, I'm hearing some keyboards flapping away there. Note, you want to make a mental note of things are out of place. Someone's got an open mic and we can hear pounding on your keyboard. Ask the police to remove any weapons or drug paraphernalia, and avoid moving the body unnecessarily. So that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, Rob, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I just had something to mention.
Yeah. I can't hear you now.